Okay, good morning. Hemshech Chaim Beis. We are in volume 2, close to the end. It's the last Maimer in volume 2, Maimer 144. The Maimer is of Ayin, Maimer Hashem, Omra Machasani, Mavram. And we are on page 1198. Aleph Kuf Tzaddik Ches. If you want to follow the actual text, if you don't have the book, just go to ayinbeis.com. It's been scanned. You could view it, download it. For those that are just joining, so I read the Hebrew text and I explain it in English. And obviously it's 1,190 pages in. So where are we? We're middle of discussing, we began actually a discussion of Riya. We're talking about Riya, which a word I haven't used really, but I think it's a good word, perception, to perceive something. So perceive can be intellectually, perceive could also be visibly. So he's distinguishing between Riyas Einei Basar. We're talking about perceiving and experiencing the divine, Elikus. So up till the paragraph Vihine on page 1198, he spoke about how Riya is a very powerful experience. That when you witness something and you cannot own it, you can't hold on to it, so to speak, it creates a tremendous aching of love. Obviously, we're talking about something you love. And it's a tremendous ache, which he calls chelas ava. On the top of page 1197, he said that ikar inyan chelas ava by the hariya belakus. That the primary chelas ava that he's been discussing can come also through his bananus, through contemplation, but primarily through Riya belakus, and he just because when you see something, it creates an abundance, an additional, an increasing amount of chukka, of yearning, longing, aching, craving. All these words are appropriate. And then he went on to speak about it with the pasuk ve'enei adam leitis be'ena, that the eyes of a person do not fulfill and satisfy. In other words, if you see something you love, but you can't own it, let's say you say a beautiful piece, a delicious piece of food, it's not going to fulfill you just because you look at it. On the contrary, the looking will make you want it more. Okay, and he goes on to explain this in Aveda, that this is sumar menechem ru'u mibara ela. So you have something to look at. Sumar menechem. It doesn't just say, like v'yadaita Ayin v'shavesa levavecha ki Hashem Elokim, just for example, doesn't say how the yadaita Hayim comes. It can come from learning Chassidus, it can come from contemplating nature, it can come from 100 different ways. But here, Sumar Menechem, the Navi is saying, raise your eyes to heaven. In other words, look at something. So since you have something to look at, that he calls Riya, and he says clearly, Einei Basar Mamish, literally with our flesh, of eyes of flesh, that we see, and from that we see the Koyach Ein Sof. We only see, in other words, and experience and perceive the existence, the mitzias of it, not the mohus, as he said on top of page 1198, and therefore it creates the yearning, because we don't have the mohus. On line 3 and 1198, it's through Riya, and that's why it causes, as words are ve'enav reis mitzius mamish, therefore it causes l'chein eni adam loitus be'ena shereis mitziusei. And he's expiring, he's yearning, he's aching to appreciate and comprehend its muhus. That is, in the words of what we've learned, the hagvul, the eliki, that manifests within nature, within existence, yesh ma'ayin, the power of godliness, the divine power to sustain the universe on an ongoing basis, like we say right after the Mabul, when Hashem promises lo yishbesu, that from here on, after the Mabul, which suspended laws of nature, including even the movements of the celestial bodies and time itself, so the Eibishter promised lo yishbesu, I will basically return my force, my divine force, that will make sure that day and night, and no longer, and everything in the natural order will not cease. Lo yishbesu will never rest. It will continuously turn like a wheel, like a clock that never stops, and it never did again. Hey, we have the exception by when Yeshua asked Shemesh be given dame. Mefarshim talk about that, what exactly that means, and God said that the sun stopped. But generally speaking, throughout history, from then, from the Mabul, that Koyach Ein Sof continues. Just to drive the point home. Okay. In this paragraph we learned yesterday, he's now going deeper. He say, I'm just reviewing what we learned yesterday. This all is Eriyas Ene Basar Mamish, which you see with your eyes of flesh, Mamish. But in truth, the Riya is also applicable and possible in his bonus Yichudei Allah. Now he clearly is adding the word his bonus Yichudei Allah. Just for the record, his bonus was used earlier as well. You see the creation, it's the creation and its sustenance, and then you contemplate on how everything in existence is nullified and equalized in the presence, and that his bonus leads to the chelas avos. So it's a combination of Riya and contemplation. He did say it at the bottom of the page, like an Eratera. I just wanted to make that point. But now he's saying the Riya is in the hisbonenus. In other words, the hisbonenus can be on such a level, Yichudei law. We'll talk about Yichudei law in a moment. That it's like as if you see it. And he's going to say after the parentheses, in other words, the eye and the mind, intellectually. The believer is chazukul, in his heart he sees everything. And he cites also from Tanya. So, but now he's talking about a level which we don't see. Yichudei law is not visible to any eye. In other words, it's not like you're looking at the sun, the moon, the bodies, the kayim be'ish, kayim svah shamayim, and svah oretz, kayom be'ish or b'min. In other words, the species being sustained, which is something that's physical, all of us can see and witness. Now we're talking about something that we are told. We're told, or we can even come to it logically. Like I've mentioned a number of times, that God is not just an artist that created the art of existence. He's beyond being an artist. So in higher levels of the divine, there's a level called Yichudei law. You're talking about Ein Sof. Let's talk about Atzilus even. That's the spheres of Atzilus, how they're bottled to the levels of the divine higher than Atzilus. So it's not something we see with our physical eyes, but it's something we can understand. And in understanding, the question is how clear can you come to understanding this? So he says it's Shayach Riya. You can come to a level of Riya, not physical, but a level that as if you see it through the clarity that you achieve in these abundance in your mind. We will, of course, discuss what that clarity is, but we haven't gotten there yet. In the parentheses, and as I pointed out, all this is the language of Eratera, the Maimer Samchuni, that the Tzemach Tzedek said in Tov Kuf Tzadik Gimel, which just for the record, I said Pesach Tov Kuf Tzadik Gimel. The Maimer of the Alter Rebbe Tov Kuf Samach Gimel was Pasha Kedeshim, which could have been. I have to look at the year if it was a Iber year, if it was a leap year, but it's either right before or right after Pesach. Most likely after Pesach, but around Pesach. So this is a Maimer Tov Kuf Tzadik Gimel, which is the equivalent of the year 1833. Tzaddik is 33. And interesting, we're now in here, Ayin Vav. So it's less than 1833, and this is said in 1915. So 33 to 15 is whatever it is. Yeah, is 67 and 15, 82 years, I think. Yeah. Okay. Now, so this is a language of the Tzemach Tzedek with additions and explanations and changes, obviously. So the Rebbe Rashab adds this parenthesis now that we learned. I'm just going to sum it up. He says that the Riya of Sumar Menechem is that besides the fact that it's Einei Basar Mamish, which he clarified, with the eyes of flesh, he also said we see it through the world. In other words, there's something that we look at, and that allows us to appreciate the Royim B'chinas Ein Sof through the world. That's what it is. When we look at the existence Yesh Ma'ayin, the Yesh itself, we look at its Hasmoda, its Tmidus, its consistent consistency and its consistent function. So that leads us to Ein Sof. So Kamei Kain, the Rebbe Rashab is clarifying, now we're discussing, we can also see Ein Sof on its own, not as it's derived from, or we learn it from the object or the world, mitzad atzmei, and also mashalamayla ma'ir, begeder elamus, as I explained. In other words, you can see that you can perceive the oil as if it's Riya, like seeing it, even when it's not attached to or relating to the object, like electricity and not the light bulb, but also the levels of the divine that are beyond the realm of elamus altogether. That's the level of Yichudei. As I explained, Yichudei Tata by definition means Tata. It's the unity below, meaning the unity within existence. Basically, it usually refers to Baruch Shem Kved Malchusei Le'elam Vod. Yichudei La Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, which, by the way, is why it's called Shema. In the Maimonid Ratei, he says, why is it Shema? Because Yichudei La, you can't see. You can only understand Shema. Now we're saying in Shema, we can also have a level of Riya, but it's still within comprehension, not actual sight. So Shema, so Yichudei La is this higher level because it's Ilah, the unity above, which means the unity of the higher levels of the divine, not as they associate with existence. Yichudei Tata is the divine as it associates with existence, and that too is Yichud Havayu Hu Elikim, as we said, Al Oretz Mitachas. Oretz Mitachas is generally, in this context, Yichudei Tata, Das Tachten. Shemayim Mimal is Das Elyon and Yichudei Allah. He didn't say this explicitly, but you can rest assured that's what he means, because he's going to say it later, and it's part of the whole picture. Okay, fine. And now he says the last part. So what's the advantage of this? If you can't actually see it with your own eyes, and it's only in the mind, so he says, actually the other way around, I'm sorry. So now that he says that, now he comes and says, Giluim. What we're seeing, what we're perceiving and appreciating in Yichudei La is the level of Giluim, not an atsumus, Ein Sof. That's what you see from existence, as I explained yesterday, because creation reveals to us a power of the Creator that Gilui Ahelam doesn't reveal. What does that mean by Gilui Ahelam? In other words, when you see Oyer, like the Oyer HaShemesh, it's not such a chiddush that the source can give off light that reflects the source, okay, but that the source can create something that does not reflect the source. In other words, in any revealed way, a yesh that is on its own, so to speak, and feels that it's independent, that tells you about the haflas habeira even more than Giluim. In truth, Eir is equal to Yesh, like he said at the top of the page. Everything is equalized compared to atsumus, but we only know that through the Yesh because we don't know about that level of atsumus that's beyond Gilui. Gilui, if in other words, if there was only God and his light and his energy, you could maybe speculate, but you wouldn't see from the energy that God is anything beyond energy, beyond a source of it, like similar to the sun being the source of sunlight. So this is, I'm just reviewing things that we've learned earlier. So there's a certain element that is revealed in Yichudei Tata that Yichudei Allah doesn't reveal, because that's Giluim. Yichudei Tata is through existence. So it has a certain mila. On the other hand, the mila, so then what's the quality of knowing the Yichudei Allah? She says, because we are not atzmisdika people. We are people who are affected by Giluim. We can't just say we're on the level of etzem. So therefore, when we appreciate God's revelation and we see it in its undiluted and unadulterated form, you're seeing it in Ein Sof, like he says, Mamish Kameshum Mitzad Atzma. If you may recall earlier, he spoke about the Mila of on page, I believe it was, the bottom of page 1190 through 1192, more or less, he spoke about the mile of Eir HaBligvul, because L'cher Eir HaGvul has all the qualities. But Eir HaBligvul has something, because it reflects, in a sense, godly divine revelation in its pure form, not being shaped or tailored in any way. It's like the difference in Eir Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum and the Kav. The Kav, no doubt, is so powerful because it shows the divine that is able to tailor and shape existence. But the evidence of the finite symptom has the quality that it just reveals Elikus, like the God in his palace, not the etzem. The God in his palace as he is on his own without, so to speak, expressing it and relating to existence. So that's the Ma'ale V'Yichudi Allah, which is basically experiencing God on his terms, not on our terms. And that's why having a Riya there has an advantage. Then he went on and said, after the parentheses, this is not Riya Gashmis, it's only Riya in the mind, Ayin HaSeichel, and yeah. And then I gave the introduction yesterday at length about what we're going to learn now about Chochma and Binah and Riya and Shmiya, what this means. Because now we need to understand the question now is, the whole thing he needs to explain now. So what is this Riya? Now that we're talking not through a physical entity, what does this mean, this higher level of perception that comes through the Riya Saseichel? In other words, you could have Seichel without Riya. You could understand something and not come to that level of clarity. So we're going to discuss now what that clarity is. But before I continue, here's a good pause because I finished the topic that I wanted to review. So if anybody has any questions, obviously if your questions, one second. Obviously, if your questions are about what we're going to learn, I would tell you to wait. If it's about what I said till now, so please.
About what you said just now, it seems to me that the Riya in Giluim is having a much more powerful effect on the person than Riya atsumus in the lower level, even Riya bein nebosam.
Yes, it has great mileage. It's like the difference between a miracle and nature. Nature is a deeper level of the divine that can even be concealed in existence. But for a human being, when you see a miracle like the parting of the sea, the hispilus is going to be more, obviously. But remember that the issue I have to qualify is that we're not seeing it on that level. We're not seeing the parting of the sea. It's going to be ultimately a Riya Saseichel. So there, we'll see where that goes, but it's definitely going to have qualities because you're talking about a higher level. If you look at the Eira Teda,
right now?
If you look at the Eira Teda that I read part of it, I'm looking at page 217 in Eira Teda Shira Shirim. I don't know the corresponding page to the Maimer and the Pesach Maimer, but if you look in there, he says clearly that there's a Maila. He says, I think he even says, Loiri Izeh, Kiri Izeh. There's a Maila in Riya, there's a Maila in Shmiya. In other words, there's a Maila in perceiving higher levels, even though you don't see them, over seeing lower levels. But there's a Maila in seeing lower levels because there's more ispilus. So here we're talking about a level of Riya, even in higher levels, which isn't physical Riya, but it is intellectual Riya or perception. Okay.
Okay, thank you. My question is, in the lower level, what is good in that? The Rabbi said before, the Rabbi Rashab, that it's bring you to Yechale Mamish, that you descend on the lower level. So I'm trying to understand, what is this? How is this more than in Giluim?
First of all, you see it with your own eyes. We talked about this at length. If you see someone that you love with your own eyes, and they're, let's say, 20 feet away from you, but you can't touch them, you can't speak to them, you can't in any way have an experience with them, it creates a tremendous aching and frustration. If you think about them, but you don't see them, and they're 1,000,000 miles away or 1,000 miles away, yes, you could also have some aching, but it's much deeper when you see it in front of your eyes, but you can't fully contain it. Like he said, if you read the Maimer, the previous thing, he speaks about it at length. Since I explained it pretty much at length, and it says it, I just refer you to read it again.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So now we continue.
Just one more. We discussed this idea of Riya Basar Mamish a lot, but did we come to a conclusion what that is? I mean, is it?
I just explained it. You see the world. It's not just something that you're imagining or thinking about. You see a physical reality. I believe
you don't see Hashem
Okay, look, since
first,
so I believe we came to a conclusion. At least I'm very comfortable with what we discussed about this. I gave a lot of examples. I went over it again and again. So in the spirit of we want to move along, I would suggest listening to the last few classes. I discussed it. And if you have a question on a specific thing I said, fine. But I believe we came to, yes, a clarity to that. At least I feel pretty clear about the idea.
so could you sum it up? Would we sum it up?
Yeah, I summed it up. I summed it up yesterday. I summed it up in the previous classes. Briefly put, you don't see electricity, but you see the light bulb that's alive. It's a lit light bulb. Do you see the light? Yes. Do you see a stone flying in the sky? Yes. So you're seeing Begashmi, it's not just the stone, you're seeing the energy that's making it move. That energy is called divine energy.
Okay.
That's the simplest way to explain it. You don't have to see, what do we think? What do you think God is? It's divine energy. You don't want to call it divine, fine. But energy for sure it is. So you don't just see a light bulb, you see a illuminated light bulb. The illumination is a physical reality. So, as I said, some people call it electricity, some people call it another name. When we see existence, we call it godly energy. But you're seeing it in action. You're not just seeing it in theory. That's the simplest explanation. But there's others. And by all means, if something needs to be thought about some more, I would go through the Maimorim, you can review the classes and so on.
Okay, thank you.
But the contrast here is very clear that when it comes to Yichudei Law, on the other hand, you're talking about the levels of divine Ein Sof that we learn about. And there we don't see it. We don't see the esospheres of Atzilus. We don't see Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum. There's nothing to hold on to. So he says there too, there's two levels of perception. One where you understand it, or you know about its existence, and the other you come to actually a Riya, a deeper perception, as if you see it, as he uses now, Ein HaSeichel, and Riya Chushis, Lebchinish Shmiya V'Avana Levad. And now he continues. So the line begins, L'hoyed Einov. So he says, V'hainu, I'm starting where, this is where we stopped. V'hainu shechochmeh hibchinas Riya, ubina hibchinas Shmiya. So, V'hainu, this means, Chochmeh is the level of Riya, Bina is the level of Shmiya. So you see right here, he didn't say Riya is Ayin. Why doesn't he say Ayin is, the eye is seeing, and the ear is hearing? He's using words Chochma and Binah. Clearly two levels in intellect, in the cognitive faculties we have. And one is associated with seeing, and one is associated with hearing. So we're not talking now about the physical eyesight or the physical hearing. We're talking about in the levels of Chochma and Binah. Just one second. I want to see a line that he uses in Eira Teda. One more minute, one second. Yeah, I wanted to explain something here. In Eira Teda on page, the Maimer that I'm looking at, page 216, he says a very interesting thing, which I think is helpful to understand what we're learning right now. He says like this: Einayim hareyes, the eyes that see, v'aznayim hashemes, and the ears that hear, himra kelim l'koyach hariya v'koyach hashmiya. They're just containers, you can say instruments or channels of the power of sight and the power of hearing in the spirit and the soul. In other words, when we see something with our eyes, yes, physical sight is the actual eye looking at an object and creating an image, and all ways that we understand how that image reflects back and you see something. You're seeing my face right now. What exactly is happening? What is the eye doing to be able to see my face? Same thing with audio, with the ears. So
Rabbi, it's Tafshin Pei Hey on the WhatsApp pages.
Okay, Tafshin Pei Hey would be 785. Good. Okay, so now he says like this. So there's the actual faculty at work, which is seeing and hearing. And you go to an optometrist, you go to a audiologist, and they give you the whole understanding of how the eyes and the ears work. But then there's the koyach hariyah. The koyach hariyah is what happens when you see something. There's a certain hisamtus, for example, a certain truth. Seeing is believing. You witness something. We know al pi Torah, and also in the secular world, when there's a witness, did you see it? Eidei gedushin. Videos are not good enough. No technology. You need two human beings who, with their own eyes, saw ish mekadesh isha, and that has more power than anything in halacha. It says, "Api shnaim yokum davar." You need two witnesses, and that's what al pi Torah consists reality. Same thing, einei edus for kiddush hachedesh, that they saw the moon, the birth of the moon, in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, when they were mekadesh al pi Riya. So Riya has more than just physical eyesight. It creates a certain level of truth and veracity that is used in court of law and is used to establish facts. We witness something. What's the expression? One of the proofs of how we know Matan Torah and everything happened, because they saw it. They actually experienced it. They saw it with their own eyes. They didn't hear it from somebody alone. Now, Shmiya, on the other hand, has other qualities. Shmiya has other things that when you hear it, etc. But there's the koyach hariyah and koyach hashmiya. Therefore, and I want to just continue reading in the Zor, right? So he says like this. So they are only kalim the koyach hariyah and koyach hashmiya. He actually brings proof. That's why a blind person can give birth to a seeing person, because it's not just the keli, it's the koyach hariyah. Anyway, then he goes on and says, so the koyach hariyah v'koyach hashmiya haruchnim, v'sheidish koyach hariyah nimshach mebchinas chochma shebenefesh, v'sheidish koyach hashmiya nimshach mebchinas binah shebenefesh. So in other words, what the physical sight and the physical hearing are rooted in spiritual faculties. And the spiritual faculties are what? The root is Chochma for Riya, and Binah is the source for Shmiya.
This is not so common. This is like a Chiddush.
Listen, please, we said we're going to just let this flow. So, okay. So he says like this. Okay. So now we're going to understand what is Chochma and Binah in the context of Riya and Shmiya. Because you could ask the question, 1 second. Chochma is conceiving an idea. What does it have to do with Riya? Binah is understanding an idea. That's all cognitive skills. It's not the chushim of Riya and Shmiya. So now he's going to explain, because we're talking now Yechudei Law. In Yechudei Law, we're talking the level of the divine that is not visible to the physical eyes of flesh. So he starts. So that's what he's going to talk now about. That's commission onuroyim. Oh, actually, 1 second. We did learn this piece. My mistake. Okay, doesn't matter. We went over it again. I'm just going to sum it up, because we did learn this example. Because now he says, so what's the difference between the two? So he says we see a big difference between someone who conceives of an idea and someone who hears about it from him. So he says, just briefly, I'm just going to go over it again. I realize we did read this. So there's a difference in clarity between a person who conceives of an idea and the one who we shared it with, who hears it about it from him. The one that conceives is like Riya. For the person who conceived of the idea, by him radiates an abundance or an increased element of light, and he has, and the clarity he has in the idea is as if he sees it himself, as if he sees it. But in regard to the other, from the other's perspective, who only heard it, he only is listening to it, he's only hearing it. So it's like a bounce away, it's a step away. And then he adds, "V'gam misha hiskelin achazman," even the person who conceived of the idea, as time passes, it's only in a form of shmiya alone by the person, because time causes you to forget. So the forget, he doesn't have the same intensity of clarity as when he initially conceived of it. At the moment, at the time when the idea entered his consciousness from the source of seichel, it's as it's by him like the level of seeing, that type of level of clarity. So in other words, you see here a difference in seichel itself. Because remember, the one who conceives the idea doesn't see the idea like I see you and you see me. We're not talking about eine basar mamish. We're talking about levels of clarity that the mind reaches. So his level of clarity is very different than the level of clarity even by him later on, and definitely by another who heard it from him. So you see here a difference in seichel itself. Like he says, okay, that's where we actually stopped. Fine. So now he continues. Even though we're talking about yediyah sichlius, we're talking about a cognitive not knowing. We're not talking about a physical sight or physical hearing. This brings me to why I began the long introduction yesterday, because he's now going to explain that seichel, there's understanding something, and then there's the clarity and the truth that the seichel teaches us, the truth and clarity about something. So he's saying that it's even though it's the idea sichlis by both of them, the person who conceived of the idea and the person who heard the idea, nevertheless, there's also something here that is above pure raw technical intelligence, mamish. L'mayla mesichli mamish. That's why I wanted to give that whole introduction, to show that seichel has an element of resonance, an element of hanakah. Sichlis, we're going to learn certain clarity, and other words we'll try to find to explain this point. So the parentheses, he clarifies what he means. L'mayla mesichli mamish. So in other words, the Riya within seichel leads you to a place that's more than just the seichel of seichel, the Binah of seichel. So Binah understands something. And the Chochma has an element that's a little more than just purely understanding. It's like giving you a glimpse into a higher reality, which, as I said, we're going to learn inside. It's been at length discussed by the Rebbe Rashab in volume 1. That's where I'm taking a lot of what I explained yesterday, what I'll continue to explain. So he says, V'hainu, what I mean by this, V'hainu, this means, L'mayla Mesichli, what does L'mayla Mesichli Mamish mean? Remember, he's not saying L'mayla Mesichli, period. L'mayla Mesichli Mamish, meaning it's not actual pure technical seichel. There's something more here, a deeper level of clarity, which is the Riya that he's going to discuss. He says, V'hainu, this means, Levad ha'anocha sichlis and isbar li'il. Besides, hanakah sichlis that was discussed earlier. Where was this discussed earlier? Not in the last few pages. I'm thinking in volume 2, I don't remember. Hanakah sichlis must have been discussed. Volume 1 for sure. There's a length in volume 1 about hanakah sichlis. She says, what we're saying here is besides hanakah sichlis. So let's explain what hanakah sichli means. Hanakah sichli, in Yiddish, there's an expression, the up leg, an up leg. Hanakah sichli is more than just seichel. You can learn something and still not feel that it's settled. I'm going to use the word settled within you, not fully integrated, internalized. I don't mean now avodah, personalized as in applying it to your personal life. I mean even your seichel. Like ideas. Before you asked the question, what does eine basar mean? So I feel a certain hanakah now that I feel I have a sense it's settled by me. I can't say I understand it perfectly, but there's a lot of ideas that you learn, that we learned today or yesterday, that you hear. You could even say you understand. But if someone says to you, is it really like settled that you're at peace with it yet? Say not yet. And then there's ideas that with time and effort and discussion and arguments and questions and counter arguments, you come to and say, this idea now is settled. I'm ready to move. And when you cut to that point, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Because then you learn something new and you compare it to what is already settled in your mind. And sometimes they can even conflict, frankly. But bottom line is that there's a thing called settled, hisyashvus. Doesn't use that word. He uses hanakah sichlis because it's a little different. I'm just trying to explain it. So hanakah sichlis means that it's an upleg where you don't have to go through the whole process again. You're now at a point where this is like a fact in your life. It's a fact. Now, how you got to this fact? We're talking about intelligent people. We're not talking about people by myth or just blind faith. We're talking here on hanakah sichlis. In science, you have the concept of certain axiomatic principles. I don't want to say axiom mamish because that's more like a muskel vision. But there are things that have become facts. Whether in math you say there's theorems and postulates and so on, there are things that have become established. Now, if you want the proof for it, you can find it. But you don't always have to go back to the proof because it became like a certain type of fact. I'm not sure if I'm even adequately fully explaining hanakah sichlis, but the point I want to make is that there's something about the seichel that's not just that it's understood, but it's actually that it is settled. Hanakah actually means settled. Hanakah means placed. Like we say, we place it down. You commit it to paper. You call it hanakah. We call it hanachas, writing the. So hanakah is a form of settled idea that it's settled within you. So he's saying, in addition to that, besides that, when we say l'mayla meseichel, we says the language l'mayla mesichli mamish. So besides the idea of a hanakah sichlis, which actually Chochma has more than Binah, because Chochma is that certain clarity that the person who conceived of the idea that he has, that a person who may be understanding the details may not have that as a given type of reality. Like you'll find many times when you come up, when you conceive of an idea, then it's developed, and they come back to you with a developed, fleshed out idea, and you say something's missing here. You didn't get it. What didn't they get exactly? They may have understood the idea, but there's something missing. They don't get the kernel, the punchline, the chidush, or whatever it may be. So hanakah sichlis is in the domain of Chochma, but he wants to say more than that. Levad zeis, levad hanakah sichlis and is bar le'il, and we definitely have to look up where that le'il is, where earlier. Hine gam hasichli ein rak b'bchinas sichli levad. So hanakah sichlis, you could say, is not even really purely seichel. It's more of let's call it a maturity and a certain element of settling. The idea has been settled within you. He's saying also the seichel itself is hinegam hasichli enedak b'chinas sichli levad. Seichel itself, the idea itself. In other words, the idea itself, the technical idea itself, is not just seichel levad. V'hainu she'idea se'inyan loidak b'yadiyah shebeseichel ki ma she'aseichel teifus se'er k'moi shu adayin l'mayla miyadiyah sichlis mamish. Okay. Yeah, I know this is very subtle, so let me explain. He says like this. So you can know an idea and know it well by understanding all the elements of it. But sometimes you learn something and you can't say, I understand all the elements, but I sense the logic of it. So he says these words exactly. It's not sichli levad, means he knows the inyan, not just yediyah shebeseichel. I'll explain the difference between hanakah sichlis and this in a minute. But first, let's explain this. A perfect example is we sometimes learn something. You may hear it and say, it makes a lot of sense. But then afterwards, if someone says to you, can you explain it to me? You don't have many words. You don't have many words. And as a matter of fact, you may not even be able to fully explain it to yourself. But you did sense the Oyer HaSeichel Shebezeh. You sensed a true, I don't want to say truth. You sensed the logic within it. It could be because the person who explained it knows it well. You go back to the person who conceives of the idea and the person who shares it with another. So the other hears it and he understands it. But he may understand it in the sense he gets it, but he can't really fully articulate it because he didn't really turn it into a full-blown logical idea yet. It's just like almost the early stages of getting something before it becomes developed into the specifics. So he's saying two things. Hanakah sichlis is almost the opposite. It's after you understand something, you come to a certain thing, it's settled within you. Here it's like before you understand it, there's a sense of something that's not sichli mamish. It's the Eir HaSeichel, like he says. I'll just read it again. Masha seichel tefes ha'er k'moy shu adayin l'mayla miyadiyas sichlis mamish. He grasps. Please. We made an agreement. Let's follow. Tefes ha'er k'moy shu adayin l'mayla miyadiyas sichlis mamish. So it's not yet that he has a yadiyas sichlis that he could say, I fully know it in seichel. He's tefes the eir of it, sensing the truth of this idea. So both these things, levad zeis, the hanakah sichlis, he's saying, these are two things in seichel that are beyond the sichli mamish, l'mayla mesichli mamish. So hanakah sichlis is lav dafke l'mayla mesichli mamish. Here he's saying, actually, one second, maybe, no, I want to correct myself. Ahainu, levad hanakah sichlis, inigama sichli. Yeah. Hanakah sichlis would be beyond seichel itself. The seichel itself has two stages. One is l'mayla yediyas sichlis mamish, and the other is yediyas sichlis. And these are all considered to be a deeper, a higher level, so to speak, than the seichel itself. Now, we still, he doesn't finalize the statement because he's going to go now into a longer explanation. But what we do come away from here is that most likely the first Chochma is the hanakah sichlis, and more importantly, the Eir HaSeichel. You get the Eir HaSeichel, and Binah would be the actual yediyas sichlis. So one would be more related to Riya, and one to Shmiya. So interestingly, when you hear an idea and there's a certain resonance, and you get it, but you can't really put it into words and so on. There's a certain truth to that that's even deeper than the words and the explanation, and that is a form of a Riya sichlis. That's what he said so far. Now, there's going to be now a long explanation, longer, relatively speaking, about Chochma and Binah and how they speak to each other. A lot of this is very dense, and as I said, I'm depending a lot on how the Rebbe Rashab explained it in volume 1. So we're going to have to, we'll work this through slowly. But so far, what we've said is that in Seichel itself, there's Riya and Shmiya, and we're talking about discovering the Riya in a Seichel, like Yichudei Elah, where you don't see it physically with physical eyes, but you can come to a clarity, a behirus, and a clarity and a resonating truth that's deeper than just understanding something. And that's what he wants to explain now, Riya on that level, the how we find Riya on the level of Seichel. Okay. Now, any questions?
I have a question. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I think that this what he is saying here is higher than hanakah sichlis. Because hanakah sichlis.
You think? I don't know if there's enough. I don't think there's enough data to determine, and I don't know about higher. What the word higher means, even. What do you mean by higher? In spiritual levels, in clarity.
Higher means it's above seichel. Hanakah sichlis.
He says on both of them they're l'mayla sichli mamish. So he didn't say hanakah sichlis is lamata miseichel.
No. Hanakah sichlis, the word means.
Okay, but Okay, I hear you. I think we'll probably get more clarity as we learn on.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Cheskel, did you have a question? I have a question.
Yeah,
Rabbi Cheskel jumped in.
Thank you.
One at a time.
Just is hanakah sichlis the idea where we say that Shosik Rav?
I think sometimes I think if I recall, sometimes it's associated with that. I don't know if it's exactly that, but I think if I recall that there's that. Maybe you should explain what Shosik Rav is so everyone else understands what you're referring to.
It's the idea of his Talmidim had questions on what he said. He was not able to respond, but didn't change what he said, and we called it.
Silent. He was quiet, but he didn't change his mind. because it was hard because he couldn't express fully the veracity, the truth of the idea, right?
Even though he was convinced that was the truth.
Yeah, it's conviction is a good word also here.
Conviction.
It's like an intelligent conviction, but not conviction as akshonus, not stubbornness. It's more of you've come to a hanakah that this is a fact, and not everybody people who haven't come to that may not fully understand why you're so sure of it. Why it's also a certainty. Certainty is good. Surety. These are all good words. Hanakah. It means settled. That you have it's an idea that you have processed over time. I mean, you ever speak to a master about any given subject, and you see it's years. They've come to certain convictions, certain clarity, certain settled ideas in their lives, and you may not understand why. You actually may even disagree with them, and you may challenge them. But you have to respect the fact that they came to it after much work. There's an element where an idea becomes a settled reality, so to speak, within the person.
Gemara and halacha be a good example?
Not necessarily, because halacha is more the psak, the final conclusion, and the Gemara is the shaka v'tarya, the argument. Is halacha like hanakah sichlis? I don't say that. I think halacha is much more the clarity that came from all the arguments, and you came to determination. It's more determination. Is it connected to hanakah? It could be. But hanakah sichlis brings to mind the story of the Rebbe Rashab. When he was at that famous asifa, a meeting in Petersburg, and this is the time when they were trying to make all kinds of different decrees to try to assimilate the Jews. They were the maskilim, and all kinds of forces. They're forcing them to learn German and other stuff. So the rabbis would get together. There was a group of the Russian rabbis from different cities. And the two chief rabbis, so to speak, or the ones that had the final veto, was the Rebbe Rashab and the Reb Chaim Halevi, Reb Chaim Abrisk, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik. Anyway, I think I'm not sure, but I think if I recall correctly, the suggestion there was about printing a siddur with German on one side and Hebrew on the other. Now, we all know halachically that's not a problem. You have siddurs today that have English, Hebrew, Russian, Hebrew, German, Italian, doesn't matter. But it was not a regular time then. So the rabbis basically all said, you know what? We don't oppose it. But then came the Rebbe Rashab and Reb Chaim. The Reb Chaim, they asked him, what is his opinion? He said he wants to hear what the Rebbe has to say. And the Rebbe Rashab said, no, I'm against it. Since Reb Chaim heard that, Reb Chaim said, I agree, I go with the Rebbe. It was vetoed, not done. Afterwards, the rabbis asked the Rebbe Rashab, and I think Reb Chaim as well did later. We know that halachically, it's not a problem, technically speaking. So why were you against it? So he says, since I'm a child, I train my body that when something is not in the spirit of Shulchan Aruch, my body goes into a convulsion. Like I feel it. And I felt this was wrong. I felt it's going to lead to problems. And so the Reb Chaim, so the Rebbe Rashab asked Reb Chaim, so why didn't you state your opinion? Why did you defer to me? He says, because I don't have that hanakah sichlis. I don't have that. I didn't reach that level. In other words, why say sichlis? You could say it's not even a sichli. That's more of a tzaddik, a rebbe, who's just senses something's wrong. But I don't think it's just that. It's sometimes you hear an idea. I'm just using it as an example. I'm not saying the story is exactly hanakah sichlis. Let me make that clear. So don't start asking me questions. There's the story. The story, however, brings to mind the following. There's sometimes someone shares an idea with you. It makes total sense, mathematically on paper, but something rubs you the wrong way. Something about it. What is that? And I'm not talking about because you're superstitious or not logical, and you just obstinately refusing. Something rubs you the wrong way. It could be the spirit of it. There's a certain hanakah sichlis that is necessary when you really want to come to a conclusion. So I think hanakah sichlis is probably helpful and necessary when you come to halacha, to know that, come to that level of clarity. But this is just some more aces to explain what hanakah sichlis is.
I wanted to ask a question, as this may apply practically. Chassidus applied in a spiritual way, and maybe I'm getting ahead of the material here, but if so, you can just say that. I'm wondering if the hanakah sichli is, in a sense, what it means as a practical matter is that it's become a part of you. Like when you know 2 + 2 = 4, like this, there's no getting away from that. You can see it, or you know that the sky is blue. Someone tries to convince you the sky is red. You would argue, if you really cared about it, to your last breath, to say, no, I know it's blue. It's part of me. It's not just like I saw it, but it's a certainty for me, and it's become a part of me. So and if you then apply this to locus, if you're getting to this level of Riya that gives you this knowledge that's lamaila misichli mamish, then you're essentially saying, now God has become even a part of me, like more so than my belief or my contemplation. But it's just like the idea of sky is blue or 2 + 2 = 4, that it becomes a part of me, and that's I'm just wondering the spiritual application of these ideas.
Good question. It's a good question. My response, very straightforward, is it's a good theory and it's a good point, but I have to say the following. What you just described is das, Chochma Binah das. If you look on page 1176, that's why I just looked into it. When you talk about hakara v'hagosha, das is what you just described, almost word for word. That's das. What we're talking hanakah sichlis is far more in chochma, not das. So it's not about, even though I did explain it in a way that you could confuse it with das, because I spoke about it being settled as a fact within you, but here it's much more of a resonating fact in almost the earlier stages of the process, as opposed to das, which is at the last stage of the process. I'm even looking, I'll tell you why, because if I recall, I think he even distinguishes between hanakah sichlis and das. And I don't remember if he says that exactly here. I definitely remember learning about it. But the points are let me just see. I think what's necessary here, since the Rebbe Rashab does say Shnizbar Le'il, I think I would like to look up, before really saying anything conclusive here, I'd like to look it up in earlier in Ayin Beis. Obviously, if any of you find anything on this topic, please point it out to me, and try to come back with a better picture based on what I recall, Chochma, Binah, and Das. Here, he's clearly talking about Chochma. We know that because he's talking about Chochma and Binah as Riya and Shmiya. So I think he's talking about the Riya sichlis of Chochma, which is besides hanakah sichlis, also what he called now the Riya or the the sensing of the But I want to look it up, and I think what you described is more like Das. That's my bottom line.
Can we use the word intuition?
As a matter of fact, hold on. 1 second. As a matter of fact, now that I'm thinking, I remember that there's 2 different levels in seichel. One is where the tamtsis seichel, which is the end process, when you conclude and everything resonates at the end of the process. And then there's the nekudas haskola in the beginning of the process. And he definitely speaks about the difference between the resonating clarity that you have the moment you conceive of an idea, like he said here, the person who conceived the idea, and what happens at the end of the process when it reaches das and the tamtsis haseichel, the conclusion of it. And I think that is where he makes these distinctions. And so again, I'd like to look it up instead of guessing or speculating or just going from memory. And it's a good discussion. We'll get there. But there's no question he's talking about here Chochma and Binah, not das. That's clear.
Can we use the word intuition, Rabbi?
I wouldn't use intuition here now. It'd be too confusing. Because intuition a seichel altogether?
No, that's not intuition.
No, 1 second. We talked about that at length in this class, intuition. I would stay away from intuition right now, not because I don't think it's relevant, but because it's just going to bring another factor in that may just confuse the matters here. So look, as I said, doesn't it make sense to look it up inside exactly how the Rebbe Rashab explains it at length, not short. I can show you exactly where it is in volume 1. He explains hanakah sichlis, he explains Riya, he explains many of these things, and we'll discuss it more informatively.
How could you understand that the same person, when he's getting the idea, it's Riya, and later it's not the same thing?
Well, you never heard that before in your life?
No,
That
I know
time
it's a
passes?
reality, but explain it.
Because time passes and you lose that type of clarity that you have right at the beginning of a process unless you refresh it.
So that means when you're getting it, it comes from
Wait a second.
deeper soul.
Are there things that you and I have learned 10 years ago and you got it at the time, and now you have to go refresh it because the time passed, you forget on a very basic level.
I think because in the moment that you're getting it, it shines from a higher source, and later this shine is not by you. I think so.
Fine, that's an explanation, but the Maisa, the Pale is like that. Why? We could also say it's an issue of memory. You don't remember, and you don't have that same. I mean, this happens all the time. People are excited about something for a real reason, and time passes. They don't have the same level of excitement.
It's not because they forget it. It's because you don't reach this level. I think so, that the Riya is only in that moment.
Well, I don't think you have enough information here to go one way or the other. I'm just saying there's different ways to explain it.
Okay.
We'll stop here, but I also feel, I'm looking here, I'm looking at the Eira Teda to see what he says here. 1 second.
Do you want me to post? I found a whole bunch of places where it speaks about Riya Sichlis.
In Ayin Beis or another
hanakah
member?
sichlis in Ayin Beis. There's okay.
In volume 1, what pages are
there's some in a lot in volume 1, and there's some in volume 2, like the tough 707. It speaks about it.
Look, for my 700 Tafshin Zayin.
Tafshin Zayin, yeah.
So, but from my point of view, why not? The more the merrier.
Okay. No, I just if it helps our situation, I'll post it.
Well, look, it definitely can't hurt to look at all that's explained. We may have to sort and make distinctions between what's what, but post it. From my point of view, would be beneficial. It'll help find things. It's okay. So we'll stop here. I just wanted to see one thing before we conclude here. In Eira Teda. Actually, this piece is an addition of the Rebbe Rashab. This whole piece that Yediyah Sichlius, this hanakah sichlis, is the Rebbe Rashab's Hesofa over the Eira Teda, just for the